Hello guys, welcome back to the Chessability channel. In today's video, we'll be covering the King David's opening. In this opening, you'll be playing as white, and the game should go as e4 and c5. So in order to play the King David's opening, you'll have to be facing the Sicilian defense. And the Sicilian defense is kind of uncommon to face, but the King David's opening is such a delicacy that you should only be facing the Sicilian defense and being able to play the King David's opening every once every 4 or 5 games. But it's right to be that way, because if you should play it anymore, then it might be too much power and you might go insane. So it is perfect this way. So after c5, the King David opening continues as such, with king to e2. So the point of this opening, the whole premise of this opening, is that once you play the king up to e2, you should, on the next move, slide the queen over to e1, and then the move following that, you should slide the king to d1. So the whole point of this opening, and I shall continue on later in this video, is that the queen is moved to the e1 to h4 diagonal, and once you push the f-pawn forward, it opens up the queen, and now the king isn't there anymore, so it isn't such a danger, even though pushing the f-pawn is mostly reasonable. But on top of that, following the next few lines of theory, with knight to f6, queen to e2, or queen to e1, knight takes e4, king to d1, opening up the queen, as you can see, pinning the knight to the king, but the knight can just move back for now, but you'll have outstanding pressure for the rest of the game, or for the rest of the opening, let's say. And then one more move you should play, as this is theory, is h3 if you reach this position. But most of the time playing h3 anyways is a brilliant move. So basically the point of playing h3 is to, of course, prevent that fried liver attack, which is very potent, very dangerous, and also is to launch for the g-pawn and the f-pawn, but h3 doesn't really prepare to launch f-pawn, only the g-pawn. But once you launch these two pawns, and maybe the third one later on, you'll have a devastating attack, with the king being safe on d1, maybe even c1 if you want to be extra safe. And you'll just have a devastating attack against the black king, because they're not going to castle long unless they're crazy. But then again, you could always like scoot the king over a little bit. But still, you'd get multiple tempos waiting that move, and you can still go over here and attack this knight for no reason. And on top of that, so the king, of course, cannot stay inside of the middle because of this queen pressure. So the king will most likely castle short side. And like I said, you'll be launching this big attack. And then another crucial move to play in the King David's opening and is, let's say like black just developed, you only have like one more move that it should be standard to play, which is d3, which, even though their queen is hitting our queen is hitting their king through one more pawn. And plus, with the push of this pawn, their queen becomes much less powerful theoretically. So basically, if both sides just develop pieces, let's say the bishop moves out here to trade this knight, or the bishop can move here to defend the king, even though there's like no attack coming. If like black either plays this is known as a hook, and you can just play the h pawn forward, and maybe even put the queen here, or even better, put the queen here, maintaining pressure, and then go over and trade this bishop off. And while the bishop is on the square, let's just say it continues like this, castles, then you can continue to push this H pawn forward, or probably even better is to push the G pawn forward first, and then try to maybe push the F pawn forward and then the H pawn, and trying to get onto this hook and watch onto this hook while your king is safe, and then the C pawn, like castling queenside, or I guess castling queenside in the Sicilian defense may look scary, but in theoretical knowledge, the King David's opening is so potent that they honestly stand no chance against this opening and should resign after a few moves. But if they decide to keep playing on, you shall, like, well, this was one variation. If they continue to keep playing on and try to develop the bishop this way, you can already start the attack. And then let's say they, like, move the bishop over here. You can always just push the F pawn forward. And now, like, if they try to trade this bishop, that's fine. Just trade the bishop, because then you get to either crack open the center and expose their weak queen, or you might even want to play this first, bring the queen over here, but it's most likely they'll castle. So, one of the best ideas is to maybe even sacrifice the F pawn opening lines, but most likely also just either pushing, or pushing here, or pushing anywhere. And then once they castle, it's just an avalanche of pawns. Like, let's say they even take this pawn, there's no stopping this attack. You can do this, you can sacrifice this pawn, but it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because you win multiple tempos against their king, number one. If they try to do the fried liver attack again on the wrong square, you can just take the free knight, and then enact an equal fried liver attack on them, and now the queen is trapped. But if the queen decides to retreat, then you will just continue with the devastating attack, and then you can either make a hook where this pawn will be, or they can either push the pawn and your pawn will live there forever, and maybe since the queen is on this E1, the H4 diagonal, you can sneak it into the dark squares if this pawn wasn't there, or over here like such, and probably even use a knight, like getting the knight to one of these two squares to try and get to this thing, and maybe even fork the king and queen. But if they take, then it just becomes a very unfortunate situation for them, as the queen can probably slide on over here, check, and then if they like move the king over, then you slide the rook over, and then if they try to block it using the rook, then they just got checkmated in one game. And that, guys, is how you successfully play the King David's opening. And now I'll show you some test games that I recorded. The first game I'm going to be showing you guys is a game I played against a 1200 on chess.com anonymously, and this is 1 minute bullets. So I start out with e4 whenever I play white to try to see if they get to play Sicilian so I can actually do my opening, and then someone finally played the Sicilian. I even audibly gasped because it's been so long, and I was so shocked someone had finally played the Sicilian that I just played it like in a normal open Sicilian, and he checked me with the bishop, grabbed my bishop, and then after he took the pawn, I took back for the knight, thinking he'd take back, or take again, but then he hung his knight, and then he moved the queen up, and I was kind of debating if to take the pawn or not. Then I noticed I could take one more pawn before my knight was captured, and then over there, I probably should have done something else, but I moved the queen up, and then we exchanged queens. And then after that, he long castled. I brought my rook to the thing, and then he brought his bishop out, the knight out. I just wanted to trade a bunch of pieces because I felt like I could beat him with just pawns, but because of the more active king. But I was hesitating or not to bring the rook out, but I decided to bring the knight, try to fork him. Then he brought the rook over, and then I brought my rook over to target the pawn, and then he gives up the pawn because there's no way of him defending it. And then he starts to push his pawn and bring his rook up a little bit, and then our knights have a little bit of a dance, like I decline his knight trade, and then a moment later I want the knight trade again. So then I attack his rook, and this is about equals because it's like I have this one pawn, but it's not going to make that much of a difference, and I'm about like 6 seconds up on the clock, and this is no increment, so every time is important. So then after like I play some random pawn moves to just gain some time, he infiltrates with the rook, and then I defend the second rank, and then I move my king back, and then I offer a trade of rooks, then again, and then like we repeat moves for like I think 1 or 2 repetitions, almost making a draw, but I didn't want to make a draw, so I pushed the G pawn. They took that pawn, and then I started pushing the A and B pawns, and he checked me a little bit. He kind of went over my pawns. I decided it was a bad idea to stop defending the G pawn, so I just kept the rook on the 4th rank. And then I moved my king towards his pawn, trying to get them. And then I ended up picking up one before I had to move my rook, and then his king came to defend a few moves later. Well, no, he did a little bit of moves with the rook first. I checked him, and I went back to the pawns, and then I decided to give him a little checks to get some time. And at this point, it was like he had 5 seconds, I had 6, so it was very close. And then he moved his king away from the pawn, so I grabbed the pawn, but then he was defending that pawn with the rook and checked me a little bit, and then he had 2 pass pawns, but like my king was so close that they couldn't really stop my rook, and I could stop them from becoming queens. And then at this point he ran out of time, and I won the game. So that's the first game. So for the second game, I decided that I would show my game between me and Sven, because I wanted to do one game against a human and one game against a bot, because the video is already long enough, so I could only really include 2 games. But I played the King David's opening against Nelson and Isabel, and I beat them both using the King David's opening, but I didn't include it in the end because I think the game with Sven was more educational and more instructive than those games, and it's just I couldn't include them all. So I start the game off with white, and plus Sven is very easy to do the King's David opening with because he plays like the Sicilian half the time. So I play e4, he plays c5, and then let's back up. e4, c5. I play the King David's opening, then I do the little king swap. He tries to do a really early pawn break, which doesn't really make any sense in the Sicilian, but this is a King David's opening, so the bots probably don't know what they're doing so far. I prepare to take the pawn and open up lines. Then he moves his queen out, so then I continue with h3. I didn't take because you always have to play h3 in case this knight comes out in 2 moves, and this bishop gets automatically developed to the square. Always watch out for the fried liver. But h3, and then he brings his knight there. I take the pawn. He brings his queen out, and then I develop with the tempo. Well, first I do d3 as a precautionary move to block this x-ray to my king. Then he develops a rook, I guess trying to play b5 and get really aggressive since my king is near the queen side. And then I attack his queen, but then he launches a devastating move like b5, and like it deflects my knight off of the c off the protection of b5. So if I take his queen, then he plays b4, and then this attack is a real thing. But I decided to take his queen anyways and endure the attack. And then he brings his bishop out, and then I give him or at first I capture with the knight because after he captures with the bishop, then when I bring my bishop out, oh, damn, the glitch. Okay, after I bring my bishop out, his bishop is pinged to the king, and then I take the bishop using my queen, so it baits him into taking with the knight, and then I take with the bishop, and then after he takes back with the king, I end up, as you can see, right down here, I end up a pawn, which is easily winnable in this situation. So after I advance my king once more, I bring my rook to check him, and then I offer an exchange of knights. Then he grabs the pawn, but all this does for me is open up lines. Like, both my rooks are very active. Then after he plays h5, a very stockfish-like move, I offer a trade of bishops. Then he brings the rook out, and then so I think him hanging his bishop was probably a move to gain like 5 tempos against me, so he would give up like 3 points of material to get activity. And then after his rook came down here, like there's just too much activity, so I kind of had to stun him for a moment and take the free pawn. So after we exchange bishop for pawn, I bring the rook up to try to exchange his active rook, and then so I pre-move taking the rook, but he takes the pawn instead, and then I exchange the rook, and that pawn's very weak. So I go to pick it up. He attacks my rook. I pick up the pawn. Then he comes over. Then he brings the rook down over here to try and grab some pawns of his own. And I was counterplaying going all the way down here and doing the boomerang technique, but then his king would just go here, and I just waste a lot of time. So I decided to go over here, get the A pawn, then go over here and get the P pawn, and then he takes my pawn with check. So I move to attack his rook. He takes my other pawn. I take his pawn. He takes my pawn. I attack his pawn. He takes my pawn. I take his pawn. So now this is a winning rook and rook versus pawn endgame because of opposition. So I calculated 52 moves into the future, and usually this would be a draw, but since our kings, like especially because I played the King David's opening, in the King David's opening you get early opposition in end games, so it's also very useful for end games if your opponent manages to survive for a decent amount of time. And then I cut his king off using the rook. Then I just advance the pawn and the king, bringing them together. He tries to get some checks in with the rook, and then changes his mind, goes there, and changes his mind again, and then goes over here. It doesn't check me at all. And then when he tries to finally give me a check after he's been able to for like 10 moves, he blunders back rank check right using the pawn and the king. So that is the final game. And that is how you win using the King David's opening. I hope you guys enjoyed.